In this video, we will explain what aperture is, how you can adjust aperture, and when you would use aperture to style an image. Aperture refers to the hole in your camera's lens. The size of this hole can be expanded or reduced by using a dial or button, which will control the amount of light that hits the camera's sensor. Each change in the size of the hole is given a number, and these numbers are called f-stops. Depending on the camera, the aperture can be adjusted through the menu screen or by using a dedicated aperture dial or button on the camera body. Increasing or decreasing the f-stops will determine the size of the aperture hole. For example, increasing the f-stop reduces the aperture, and decreasing the f-stop increases the aperture. Different lenses have different maximum and minimum apertures. A maximum aperture of f1.8 is wide and lets a lot of light in, while a minimum aperture of f32 is narrow and lets very little light in. Each lens has its own limitations in terms of f-stops. In other words, not all lenses will allow you to go as low as f1.8 or as high as f32. Some zoom lenses also have a variable minimum aperture range depending on how zoomed the lens is. For example, a standard zoom lens of 18 to 55 mm will have a maximum aperture range of f3.5 to f5.6, depending on how zoomed the lens is. So when the lens is zoomed to 18 mm, the maximum aperture is f3.5, but when you zoom in to 55 mm, the maximum aperture is now f5.6. An aperture of f3.5 on this popular telephoto lens will mean that the aperture will be fully open at a zoom focal length of 18 mm and allow the most amount of light into the camera sensor. This is useful in situations where there is not much light, such as indoor photography. An aperture of f22 with the same lens will be almost fully closed and will allow the least amount of light in. This is useful for situations where you may want to reduce the amount of light entering the camera's sensor, such as bright outdoor daylight photography. As we can see, aperture plays an important role in the exposure of an image, but has an equally important role in the style of an image. This is because aperture has the ability to adjust how much or how little of the photo is in focus. This focus style is known as depth of field. As the f-stop is decreased, it also decreases the detail which is in focus in the image. This draws the eye to a particular area of detail, such as the face in a portrait. This focus style is known as a shallow depth of field. As the f-stop is increased, it also increases the amount of detail which is in focus in the image. This is often used in landscapes and cityscapes, where there is a desire to have as much detail in focus as possible. This focus style is known as a deep depth of field. So, we can see that aperture plays an important role in the amount of light in an image and the area that is in focus in an image. The rule to remember is the lower the f-stop, the brighter the image, and the shallower the depth of field, and the higher the f-stop, the darker the image, and the deeper the depth of field. Now that we know what aperture is and how it can be used, it is important to think about why we set our aperture at a specific f-stop before taking a photo. Good practice is to set your aperture to a mid-range f-stop of f8. This gives you room to further adjust your aperture depending on the amount of light needed for a correct exposure and the amount of the image you want in focus.